All right, welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 6, Comparing Monopoly and Perfect Competition. Now that we've looked at both of these market structures and how they choose their profit maximizing output and the price that they charge, we're going to do some things to analyze using the graphs we know now what exactly the difference is, especially in terms of overall benefit to society. We've talked about this going back to the beginning of the class. How can we use the concepts of how markets work to talk about how society benefits or how society loses out if it's not as efficient or as beneficial as possible. So we're going to define a couple new types of efficiency that are pretty significant, and then see how that applies to markets that are in a monopoly market structure versus a perfectly competitive market structure. So the first slides that I have up here, we've already seen. The second, I think, slide in the monopoly chapter was this slide here that just puts the supply and demand curve up and compares the perfectly competitive equilibrium with the monopoly price and quantity. So we can see from this, we've already said that compared to perfect competition, I'm just reading off here now, a monopolist reduces output and raises price. So monopoly, we know from that, has decreases the overall quantity compared to what it would have been in a perfectly competitive market and raises the price. So there's obviously some harm, kind of intuitively, we see some harm to consumers from this. It's good for the monopoly compared to how the monopoly would be if it was a perfect competitor, because it's much more profitable, but there's obvious harm to consumers. Okay, let's get to even more levels of specificity here. First, let's look at the, again, a review slide where we compared for the individual firm. This is for a firm, for a perfectly competitive firm, they face a perfectly elastic demand curve, whereas the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve. That's true of the firm, but remember for the market, now I want to make another addition to this graph. For the market in perfect competition, remember that it also faces a downward sloping demand curve. And we could even say that this perfectly competitive market demand curve would be exactly the same as a monopoly demand curve if we're talking about the same good here. It's not, the market structure itself doesn't determine the demand for the good. It's how much consumers are willing to pay, how much benefit they get out of it. So we can really think of the demand curve for this good, if it were perfectly competitive, being the same as it would be for the entire market, the same as it would be for a monopoly. And then also remember, in perfect competition, the market price was set by the interaction of supply and demand. Whereas I said there's no supply curve for a monopoly. A monopoly simply picks the profit maximizing price and quantity to charge and just produces at that level. It doesn't have a range of prices and quantities that it might choose. It's just going to maximize profits, choose that amount. Whereas the supply curve is the way that it is, because depending on the price, more or less will be supplied. Okay, so there's a quick thing, reminder of kind of how the market works, and to compare, to kind of preview how we're going to put these together eventually into one graph. So let's get a little bit closer to that on the next graph. Now I'm going to take us back to the firm graph in perfect competition. This actually goes back in your slideshow a few pages. If you're following along on that, you got to turn back to when we first looked at the perfectly competitive firm, and we looked at one that is breaking even. You also should remember that since the firm is breaking even, that is the long-run equilibrium for this market. So to predict that that's where this market would settle eventually, in a perfectly competitive market that's stable and is going on for a while, we can predict that firms are producing at this break-even level. So we know all that already. Okay, let's make a couple of points about this in terms of efficiency. We're going to define two types of efficiency here. First is called productive efficiency. This is the kind of efficiency that most quickly comes to mind when you think, what does efficiency mean? The first thing that comes to mind is probably, well, you're producing this stuff the most cheaply you can, with you're making the most out of the resources that you have. And that's basically what we are talking about. That you're productively efficient if you're producing at that minimum average total cost level, the minimum point of average total cost. So technically, productive efficiency is achieved if the price of the good is equal to the minimum average total cost of production. And we can see that in the long run, for a perfectly competitive firm, that is the case. The price is 14, quantity is 4. At that quantity and price, the average total cost is also 14. So at point C, the average total cost is 14, which is equal to the price. So this is productively efficient because the price is equal to the minimum average total cost. We also say because it's the quantity that minimizes the per unit cost. Any other quantity, if they produced 6 units, then they'd be spending more to produce each unit. They wouldn't be as productively efficient. The second kind of efficiency we need to define is called allocative efficiency. Allocative, as in allocating things to different, allocating different goods to different people, or maybe allocating different resources to the production of different items. And that's really what allocative efficiency is about, is how are we making the correct use of our resources towards this good versus any other possible good to which those resources could be going. So for instance, one of the resources that goes into making these tomatoes is the land. We're making best allocative use of that land. We're using that land in an allocatively efficient way if we are putting that land towards tomatoes, if it's the right decision to put that land towards tomatoes versus putting that land towards some other good. The definition of allocative efficiency is if price is equal to marginal cost. If the price is equal to the marginal cost of production, then it's allocatively efficient. Why is this? Remember we said if they're producing too little and then the price is greater than the marginal cost, we're allocating not enough resources toward this good. We should be increasing output. We should be allocating more resources toward this good. Whereas if they're producing, again, 6 and the marginal cost of production is greater than the price, we're allocating too many resources to this good. We should be producing less of this good. So that's allocative efficiency. And what you probably noticed, hopefully, as I was going through this slide, is that perfect competition in the long run is both allocatively efficient and productively efficient, because the price is equal to the minimum average total cost and the price is equal to the marginal cost. Another way of thinking about that is all 3 of these intersect at the same point, which is the firm's quantity of output. So all that's to say that perfect competition is as efficient as you can get according to these 2 definitions, which is the way that economists define efficiency. Remember, another way we defined efficiency back in the first unit was with surplus, was consumer and producer surplus. So we'll come back to that in a couple slides. But now let's go on to look at the productive and allocative efficiency of monopoly. Okay, first, is a monopoly productively efficient? Let's look at, is the price equal to the minimum average total cost? The price of monopoly charges is here, PM. At that quantity, QM, average total cost is given here by point C. So no, price is not equal to the minimum average total cost. Price is greater than average total cost. There's the average total cost, actually shows it on here. So, not productively efficient. How about allocatively efficient? Is the price equal to the marginal cost? Again, here's the price. At QM, the marginal cost is there at point A. So again, no. The price is greater than the marginal cost of production. And the price is also greater than the minimum average total cost of production. So a monopoly is neither productively efficient nor allocatively efficient. Compared to the efficient, we can see on here that compared to the productively efficient quantity, which we could find here, the minimum average total cost, we're producing too much. Although compared to the allocatively efficient quantity, here P equals MC, we're producing, in a sense, too little. And that's the next thing that we want to look at here. The one other thing I want to do with this graph is to say, what point on this graph would the firm, would the market have? What market price would prevail and what quantity would prevail if this market were perfectly competitive? What point on this graph is the perfectly competitive point? The perfectly competitive price and quantity. Competitive. So the answer to that comes from, I'm going to step backwards for a second, how we figure out what the supply curve is related to the marginal cost of production, related to the market equilibrium of supply and demand. So here we go. Remember that in perfect competition, the marginal cost is equal to the supply for the firm. And remember that the supply for the market is just equal to the sum of the individual firm's marginal cost curves. And then finally, remember that I said that the demand curve for this perfectly competitive firm is really the same, if you're talking about the same good in the entire market, as the demand curve for a monopolist. So what that means is, if we go down here, if this market were perfectly competitive, let me try those marks in blue, this demand curve would be the same. Demand equals demand for perfect competition. This marginal cost curve would be the supply curve in perfect competition. And the market equilibrium then of supply and demand is simply there, where marginal cost, or now supply, crosses demand. So our perfectly competitive price and quantity in this market, if you're not already labeled, is here. PC and QPC. We'll call that point, we don't have a point E on here yet. So that's point E. And compared with the monopoly, the perfectly competitive quantity is greater than the monopoly quantity, and the perfectly competitive price is less than the monopoly price. And lo and behold, if we go back to this slide, that's exactly what we saw here. Quantity for perfect competition is greater than the monopoly quantity. The price for perfect competition is lower than the monopoly price. Here's a monopoly point, here's a competitive point in the same way. Here's the monopoly profit max point, here's the competitive point. So we're really doing the same thing, just kind of showing it in different ways. So what you need to be able to do from this is a couple things. One is to explain this productive efficiency and allocative efficiency concept to be able to say, yes, a perfectly competitive firm in the long run is productively and allocatively efficient because price is equal to marginal cost and minimum average total cost. That a monopoly is not productively and allocatively efficient because, same reasons we went over here. And then on a graph, be able to compare the monopoly profit maximizing price and quantity with what the price and quantity would be if the firm was if the market was perfectly competitive, which is again point E. Okay, lastly, we can do this with the concept of surplus, which, remember, surplus is also another way we talked about it as similar to efficiency. Technically, it's benefit. We could also say that efficiency, both productive and allocative efficiency, is achieved when you maximize producer and consumer surplus. It's just another definition of efficiency. And when you're both allocatively and productively efficient, you're going to be maximizing producer and consumer surplus. And here's why. Before we get into these graphs that are on this slide, here's a perfectly competitive market, supply, demand, quantity, and price. PC market. Remember that we've already seen when we did our study of consumer and producer surplus that in a market like this, the point that gives you the most producer and consumer surplus, that maximizes it, is the equilibrium point. Any other point, any other price that's charged, will give less total surplus. Here's the consumer surplus at equilibrium, here's the producer surplus at equilibrium. It's maximized, the surplus is maximized when you're at that equilibrium point, which also is, again, the perfectly competitive price, which is equal to the minimum average total cost of production and the marginal cost. So it's efficient in both of those senses. Okay, now we can look at this on one of these monopoly graphs too. So here, your book does it with one of these constant marginal cost lines because that makes it a little bit simpler. So let's use that. So again, if the marginal cost is equal to the supply curve, if this was a perfectly competitive market, so this is kind of a weird perfectly competitive market. It's one where the marginal cost is constant, so the supply curve is perfectly elastic. You won't see that very often, but hopefully that makes sense as to why. Then the perfectly competitive point here is QC and PC, and the entire consumer surplus is everything above the price and below the demand curve. And now, if that market becomes a monopoly market, if one firm monopolizes it somehow by creating barriers to entry, keeping other firms out, then now we have the marginal revenue curve you see here. The firm chooses its quantity based on the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. There's the quantity, there's the price. Since that's the new price, now the consumer surplus is shrunk to this little bit here. We've already seen how this is the monopoly profits, and the profit would also be equal to the producer surplus for the monopoly. And this whole amount here, the decrease in quantity, the missed opportunity transactions, remember we called it the deadweight loss. It used to be part of consumer surplus. Now it's not part of consumer surplus or producer surplus, so it's deadweight loss. It's lost benefit from the transactions that aren't happening. We could do that same thing on this graph. We just added a marginal revenue curve. Here's the monopoly quantity and price. Here's the consumer surplus. Here's the profit, which is equal to producer surplus. And here's the deadweight loss. So all that's shown is that you can use surplus to illustrate the benefits of a perfectly competitive market over a monopoly market to society by showing that you have some deadweight loss from a monopoly. You have deadweight loss because a monopoly is selling less units of this good at a higher price. There's missed opportunity transactions. If there were not a monopoly market and more firms came in, then there would be people who would be willing to buy it if the price were able to come down a little bit, and firms that sell it still making at least normal profit, and that would be better for society as a whole. Okay, the AP test loves this concept, so we'll see it on some free response questions, and we'll do those in class. See you then.